Hello, I'm Emma Wegner, Associate Educator for Public Programs and Creative Practice at the Met. I'm speaking to you from the ancestral lands of the Wabanaki Nations. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second of two sessions that make up this year's Annual Textile Conservation Colloquium. We're so pleased that you're able to join us today. The Textile Conservation Colloquium is made possible by the generous support of the Lenore G. Tawney Foundation. Today's session is Reinstalling Art of Native America, the Charles and Valerie Diker collection, Three Perspectives, and examines a unique dialogue and exchange of ideas between Met curators, textile conservators, and a living artist, Marie Watt. After our presentation, we will have some time at the end for some questions. You can type your questions into the Q&A feed, and our presenters will answer them in the Q&A segment at the end of the hour, to be moderated by Cristina from Textile Conservation. I'm pleased to now hand over the virtual podium to Janina Poskropko, Conservator in charge of the Department of Textile Conservation, who will introduce today's speakers. Janina?
Thanks, Emma. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second part of Textile Conservation Third Annual Colloquium. We are grateful for the support of the Lenore Tawney Foundation and our partnership with the Education Department, especially Emma Wagner, Mariana Siciliano, Alex Zilka, and Anastasia Gatnik. Last week, we began our colloquium with revisiting the Art for the Community exhibition that showed the important role of the Met in building ties with community in the past and now. Today, we are meeting with artist Marie Watt, a citizen of Seneca Nation. We are thrilled to have an opportunity to engage in conversation with a contemporary artist about her philosophy, inspiration, and expectation that inform her creative process. Her artwork, Dreamcatcher, was acquired by the museum this year, and it is included in Art of Native America, an exhibition dedicated to the collection of Valerie and Charles Diker. Our interaction with Marie began a few months ago when the Met's American Wing Department decided to display her Dreamcatcher in the exhibition. The conservation treatment and display methodology of the Dreamcatcher was undertaken in collaboration with Sylvia Yount, Lawrence Fleischman, Curator in charge, the American Wing, and Patricia Marroquin-Norby, Associate Curator of Native American Art. Entrusted with the preparation for installation of this beautiful work, we had many questions regarding the textiles hanging system, present condition, and future preservation of Marie work. That prompted us to set up a meeting with Marie to better understand her creative process and intention. We learned from Marie about the significance of the heritage in the process of her art's creation, and the reflection of tradition in the choice of materials she uses, their stage of preservation, and the importance of natural degradation, which all are welcome as the witness of significant life events. Before Marie introduces her art and the role of the community in its making, Alexandra Barlow, Assistant Conservator, Liaison for American Wing Textile Collection, will give a brief overview of textile conservation recent responsibilities in caring for the Native American textile collections. She will also highlight a few textiles she prepared for the exhibition together with another colleague, Conservator Cristina Carr. They both would then engage in conversation with Marie, continuing their early dialogue to discuss textiles from different perspectives. Thank you very much for joining us today. Now, Sylvia Yount will begin our presentation by sharing some background on the museum's acquisition of Marie's what work, Dreamcatcher, and their reinstallation of the galleries. Welcome, Sylvia.
Thank you so much, Janina. I'm very pleased to be introducing this program today from the ancestral lands of the Monacan peoples outside Richmond, Virginia. But I deeply regret that Patricia Marroquin Norby, as you heard from Janina, the Met's first ever curator of Native arts, cannot be with us today because of some important community work she was called to do with tribal elders while in New Mexico this week. Still, I speak for both of us when I say what a great pleasure and privilege it's been to bring into the Met's collection a major work by our special guest today, Marie Watt, untitled Dreamcatcher, which is evident in this slide, now graces the entrance to the American Wing's latest rotation of art of Native America, the Charles and Valerie Diker collection, our ongoing installation of primarily historical Native arts. As some of you in the audience may know, when the Dikers made the promised gift of their collection in 2017, it marked the first time that the American Wing, the Met's Department of Historical Painting, Sculpture, Works on Paper, Furniture, and other decorative arts by largely Euro-American makers, featured Indigenous production. Up to that point, a single gallery of Native works could be found on the other side of the building in the museum's AAOA, or Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas Department, also known as the Rockefeller Wing. With no curator of Native arts then on the staff at the Met, a guest curator, Gaylord Torrance, at the time senior curator of American Indian art at the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, was brought on for the inaugural Art of Native America display. We were very lucky to have expertise in the person of Christine Giuntini, the longtime conservator for AAOA, who had the most experience with Indigenous American art at the Met over the years, including working specifically with the Dikers holdings. While Christine continues to be a tremendous resource for all of us, formal oversight of Native textiles now falls to our valued colleagues in Janina's department, specifically Alexandra Barlow and Cristina Carr, both of whom you'll hear from shortly. As apparent from this slide, the 2018 exhibition of Art of Native America was intended to be different from the presentation of Indigenous arts previously seen at the Met, both in its design, a minimalist display that privileged the works in a light and airy space, as well as in its conceptualization. Inspired by our advisory committee of Native and non-Native specialists, from the start, we focused on the importance of multiple perspectives and dialogues in both presentation and interpretation, something that began at the entrance to the display, as you see with those projected quotations on the wall. After Patricia's arrival at the Met last September, when we began to discuss the upcoming reinstallation in earnest, honoring a contemporary Indigenous artist with regional roots became paramount. I first had the pleasure of meeting Marie around the opening of Art of Native America in the fall of 2018, and long hoped the Met could collaborate with her on a project. Marie, a citizen of the Seneca Nation with German and Scottish ancestry, is a multidisciplinary artist who explores intergenerational social practice and storytelling through sculpture and collaborative action. She holds an MFA degree in painting and printmaking from Yale University, and also attended Willamette University and the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. In addition to the Met, her work is represented in the collections of the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Albright Knox Art Gallery, Yale University Art Gallery, the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian and the Renwick Gallery, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, the Seattle Art Museum, as well as the Denver Art Museum, and that list happily continues to grow. In fact, Denver is where you can see her current exhibition, Each Other, a collaborative effort with fellow social practice Indigenous artist Kanupa Hanska Luger, that's on view till August 22nd before traveling to the Carlos Museum on the campus of Emory University in Atlanta this September, just in case any of you are in the area. Patricia and I felt that Marie's powerful artwork, often generated in community-based sewing circles, would create a dynamic and welcoming introduction to the updated Art of Native America display, especially given Marie's description of Dreamcatcher as evoking a portal into different realms. We were simply thrilled that this sculptural wall hanging was available, and the opportunity to install it alongside another community-made contemporary work, a striking garment fashioned for Northern traditional dance competitions by the Lakota artist and activist Jody Archambault that I had brought into the collection in 2019. This combination of the works really made the Dreamcatcher's acquisition all the more fortuitous. So in a short amount of time, reflecting a nimbleness unusual for the Met, I should say, the purchase set in motion a series of meaningful conversations between Marie, Patricia, and our textile conservation colleagues, Alexandra, Barlow, and Cristina Carr, about how to display and care for this special work, which is made from content-laden, reclaimed, and community-donated blankets, conversations that had really already begun between Alexandra and Patricia regarding some new historical additions to the art of Native American installation, in fact, garments also made by Indigenous women. And with that preamble, I'm happy to now turn things over to Ali for her to share more about that exciting process. And thank you all for joining us today.
Hello. Thank you, Emma, Yanina, and Sylvia for their introductions, and to Marie for joining us today. I'm going to share with you a little bit about the work we do in textile conservation for exhibitions and rotations in the galleries, which, if you joined us last week, you heard a little bit about from my colleague, Julia Chiostrini. I'll share briefly about some of the textiles that Cristina Balloffet Carr and I prepared for Art of Native America, the Charles and Valerie Diker collection, primarily focusing on the incoming of Marie Watt's untitled Dreamcatcher. Marie will then present about her work. I would like to start with discussing a key aspect of our work as textile conservators that is relevant to this presentation, and that is that the one thing that is always true in our work is that every artwork demands its own individual set of questions. We have conservation guidelines, procedures, and protocols that help guide us to look at each work and its needs for preservation, but truly each work is different and often requires varied approaches. Sometimes this is a focus on materials and techniques, and sometimes this is also considering cultural values. Here you can see my colleagues in our laboratory looking closely at textile materials. Cristina is looking at the techniques of an embroidery through magnification, and Christine is examining the fibers of a textile to identify them better and understand the work. On the lower part of this slide, you can see some examples of images captured during examination that serve as documentation. As can be expected, the rotation of Art of Native America for 2021 was further complicated by the COVID-19 pandemic. We were working on a condensed timeline with limited time on site. However, we were able to meet with the curators, Patricia and Sylvia, to discuss conservation needs for the textile works in the museum. In the exhibition. As mentioned before, every object has its own individual set of needs, its own history, much of which is unknown to us. It's through analysis, research, and ever ongoing dialogue that we have a better understanding of how to properly care and display these works and what must be prioritized for the piece in front of us. Sometimes this can be both a materials-based approach and also a people or community-based approach. Here's Cristina in conversation with Sylvia and Patricia in textile conservation. I will now share two examples of treatments undertaken for this exhibition before we move on to Untitled Dreamcatcher. This 19th century Lakota infant's vest is primarily composed of leather and glass beads, but it had condition issues with the textile components. As you can see here, the neckline is bound in a textile that's deteriorated, exposing the warp threads. Cristina and I looked closely at the neckline under the microscope and decided that encasing it would prevent further deterioration during any handling, display, and in future storage. Here you can see a before and after of this treatment with the fragile binding encased in silk crepeline bias tape. There was another, more complicated conservation issue on the vest that we had to address prior to display. Ribbons attached to the vest in the past were in very fragile condition, holding on by one thread. Some of them appeared to have been reattached in the past, but had continued to degrade. Patricia communicated with community experts to gain more insight into the significance of the ribbons, how best to address them, and we discussed with our conservation colleagues across the museum options we had before the show opened. After learning more about the significance, that they were likely attached in the past by an individual close to the child, Patricia requested that we devise a solution to keep the ribbons physically connected to the vest to honor the integrity of the individual who originally attached them to the infant's garment. We made a collaborative decision to remove the fragile ribbons, leaving the original threads in place. We made a small pouch that would keep the ribbons flat and secured it on the inside left side. Invisible when viewing the vest in the gallery, but the ribbons are still physically connected. For a second example of a conservation treatment for art of Native America, I will discuss this seminal man's shirt, on loan from the collection of Charles and Valerie Diker for the exhibition. The shirt came in on a very simple mount. During the incoming condition check of the shirt, we examined all the seams and identified some that had opened up, needing to be secured before display. Through discussion with the curator, we also agreed to construct a male form to display the pieceworked shirt. The creation of this mount really was a communal effort, both in textile conservation, where all of us with costume mounting experience gathered, and across the museum, where the metal shop made the stand, the preparators helped with an internal support, and our colleagues in the American Wing, Costume Institute, and Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas contributed their knowledge and tools. Images from the early 20th century of Seminole men wearing similar garments guided us and informed the way the shirt would ultimately drape on the mount. It was through this communal effort, along with image-based research, that we were able to sculpt a more lifelike male figure. Here you can see the shirt as it's presented in the galleries. I have shared a bit about our work in textile conservation, some of the ways that we approach objects, particularly those we recently prepared for Art of Native America. Now I will get to the reason for our event today, which is the recent acquisition of Marie Watt's untitled Dreamcatcher from 2014. When Marie's work arrived at the Met, we had not seen it up close. Honestly, we were more preoccupied at that time with the size of it and preparing a large case for its display. We knew that she worked with reclaimed textiles, but as was shared earlier in this presentation, every artwork has its own set of needs, and we didn't know what that would be for this work until it arrived at the museum. As we unpacked Dreamcatcher on the table, we started to observe significant details that provided more and more information about the work. We could see that it had been constructed by many hands by the different stitching techniques used to connect the patchwork design. We could also see that some of the textiles used in Dreamcatcher were in fragile condition. Some seams had opened up, and some satin bindings were deteriorating. It was this combination of seeing the small details in the textile and taking in the cohesive artwork that we realized we had to discuss with the artist her intention for the work and her vision for the long-term preservation of it. Many of the textiles we come across in the Met's collection are made by unknown artists and craftspeople. We don't have this opportunity to speak with them about their intention. We make informed decisions based on our conservation training, research, and museum standards. So we were able to connect with Marie through her gallery, Mark Strauss, and set up a time to speak over Zoom. Yanina, Cristina, Patricia, and I all met with Marie to discuss some of our questions about how to care for her work in a way that honors her intentions now that it has entered the Met's collection. We found this dialogue to be insightful, but we also found, unsurprisingly, that we had a lot to talk about. We connected over materials, techniques, and ways of looking at past repairs. We shared information about our hanging system that we use for many tapestries, carpets, and textiles in the Met's galleries, using hand-stitched Velcro to secure the textile close to the wall and manage rippling on the bottom. Marie shared with us her desire to present the work further away from the wall through a custom-designed hanging rod that accentuates movement. Here you can see Marie's piece hanging on her custom-designed mount in the Met's galleries. She also provided us with clarification on when she sees the need for a conservator to intervene, when the structural integrity of the cohesive work needs to be secured. We were even able to connect about types of thread she uses in her work and we use in ours. This conversation brought clarity to the fragile bindings, that we will allow the deteriorating satin to continue its natural degradation without intervention. Should textile fragments fall off from, say, the fragile pink binding we saw earlier, we will collect them, but not reattach them. As Untitled Dreamcatcher is now part of the permanent collection of the Met, we plan to leave a written record of this conversation in the object file so that the intentions can be respected by future generations of textile conservators at the Met. We felt that our conversation with Marie could and should continue, and we're so grateful that we're able to connect here again and with all of you. Now that you have the background story, I'm going to invite Marie to share more about her work, after which Cristina and I will rejoin Marie so that we can collectively discuss some textile topics.
Thank you, Janina, Ali, and Sylvia for your remarks. I am calling in today from the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Clackamas, and Confederated Tribes of the Chinook Nations. And it is an honor to share my perspective on this conversation about Untitled Dreamcatcher. So as I remember the process in which this piece was being considered for acquisition, I received a call from Tim Hawkinson at the Mark Strauss Gallery, and he said, "Marie, don't be alarmed, but the conservators at the Metropolitan Museum of Art would like to talk with you about Untitled Dreamcatcher." And I instantly did feel some alarm. There was a phone call and then a formal letter from Janina, and then a Zoom conversation that led to a discussion about the condition of the artwork. And some of these images were included in the letter to me. And one of the things that I realized in looking at these remarks, such as deteriorated red satin binding, I started to think about how, for me, the object wasn't really deteriorated. What I saw in that decay was not deterioration, but the actual story of use. And so it's one of the things that drew me actually to these reclaimed blankets I work with. I explained to the group that for me, bindings are ledger-like, and their wear tells us something about their story and history of use. And when I use the word ledger-like, I'm really thinking about the sense that they're imprinted upon with this kind of physical and metaphysical matter of dreaming and waking life. I also shared a little bit about my process. And in about 2003, I started hosting sewing circles in my home studio. And when I started them, I was using email to invite people to come. And I would tell people that they didn't need sewing experience and they could come and go as they wished, and I would feed them. And we would sit around and just talk. And the initial idea was that the sewing circle might be like a barn raising where many hands create light work many hands come together. I guess it is to create light work, but then that something larger would be created, but then I would also, go to somebody else's space and help share in the making and production of something. And so one of the things that I realized in the process of hosting the Open to the Community Sewing Circles is that what compelled me was less about a means to an end and a means to making something, but what happened in the actual gathering. And so the sewing circles in some ways became more formalized. And again, this is an actual sign that I created that just explains the invitation. So I will trade a print for your time and feed you when circumstances permit. No sewing experience is necessary. You're invited to come and go as you wish, and you're encouraged to bring a friend. The sewing circles grew from these sort of intimate gatherings in my home studio to much larger and ambitiously scaled projects. I was invited to the University of Washington to work with a class of students, and I think there were 60 students, and I had to consider how to change my process in order to include more people around the table. And so I started working with kind of individual panels that would come back together to create larger pieces. This is an image from a sewing circle that occurred at the National Gallery of Canada in 2013, in which over the course of 3 hours, there were over 230 participants. And one of the things that I love about this image is in a way, like for me, it conjures the image of what it might be like to occupy or share a table in a longhouse and be connected with family and extended family members. One of the things that I'm interested in is in these events is how they're multi-generational, cross-disciplinary, and intercultural gatherings. And in a way, this isn't just an Indigenous model for teaching and learning, but a model prior to Western institutionalized education that is a part of all of our stories. One of the things that I like that happens in these gatherings is that their participants sometimes are as young as 2 to 90. And this particular image I wanted to share with you because this young man on the left, when he arrived, he I think has this sort of punk aesthetic, and he had tailored his own clothing, and he packed his own needle and scissors, and he was sitting next to these women from a different generation, and they really just sort of instantly got down to work, but also just conversation. And I think in the sewing circles, I always hope that maybe friendships or new connections can be made. This is an image from the Block Museum where we co-hosted an equity sewing circle and it's also an example of how my process has shifted a little bit to include embroidery and text. And one of the things that's interesting to me with this particular process is I feel like you can actually see the individual mark and stitch made by the people who participate. It's also important to know that oftentimes what is stitched in a sewing circle remains unfinished. And so there's a lot of handwork and tying up of loose ends that happens in my studio. In these particular pieces, I'm also interested in how a stitch is not only like a person's fingerprint or signature. I also have started to think about how it's an extension of one's body and even the cadence of one's voice. In the earliest sewing circle pieces, oftentimes people would sit around a table, and I wanted to just share a little bit about the construction method. I would draw images on my studio wall using, rather than paper, I would be using this product called interfacing, and it was an iron-on interfacing. And so I would typically cut the drawing up in parts. Sometimes it would even be numbered, although this one obviously is not. And then the component part, or in this case, the diamond shape, would be ironed onto a piece of reclaimed wool blanket, and then it would be cut out. And then I would actually take the interfacing off of the back of the diamond because I'm not really fond of the body that the interface kind of brings to the object. So the interfacing, while it's a patterning material, it's not ultimately present in the work. When stitching with large groups of people and in community, oftentimes the design was then basted down, or in this case, I can tell that there's pins kind of pinning down the diamonds, and basting or loose stitching the imagery down allowed the objects to be portable and more easy for people to stitch in community. So the construction method would oftentimes go from being on my wall to being on a flat surface. And in this particular piece, this piece, the diamonds actually start to expand beyond the square or rectangular edges of the blanket. And I think that one thing that I've learned in working with blankets for now, almost 20 years, is that I'm really drawn to the fact that blankets aren't really square or rectangular objects, even though we might perceive them to be that way. They oftentimes take on the shape of one's body. And I think that's a very important part of their nature. And so in many ways, when I present the work, I'm interested in highlighting this organic quality that is part of the fabric's nature. And it's also part of the way that we use blankets. And I think I will go ahead and just leave it at that. Thank you, everyone, for your time. And now I am going to hand the conversation back to Ali Barlow and Cristina Carr.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was great. And it's so interesting to be thinking through actually the construction process with you in reverse. And some of the things were surprises, and some of the things were absolutely what you would think if you were thinking logically through a construction like that. We put together a few questions that we sent you, so I'll go through them, and you can choose to answer as much or as little. And actually, the first question was about your overall design and how you guide a communal project like that and maintain such a strong design, a cohesive design. It's clearly your work, even though it's the work of many, and which is interesting in itself. So we'll skip that question. But during our initial conversation, what we did discuss was you're wanting to have your work presented as living and in relation to its display. And that is a conundrum when something enters a vitrine or a museum. It's how do you present something and retain its dimensionality while stopping its action? So what do you think about that?
I think that conversations like this open up what is possible. For me in my work, early on, I actually did hang work using Velcro strips and hanging it flat to the wall. And then I started to feel like that was a very conservative way of presenting the work, and not just conservative, but I felt like it didn't really highlight the nature of the object. And I feel like in some ways, when textiles are presented in museums, their life and livelihood is diminished by the way they're presented. So they're presented in a way that showcases maybe the beautiful handcraft or the beautiful techniques that went into the object's construction, but then we're not allowed as viewers and tactile learners and storytellers to understand what that object has to share. And so I think that that's a loss for people who are interacting and engaging with the work. And so back in, 2012 or 14, I started really moving the work away from the wall, sometimes completely off the wall so you can walk around it. But I became more interested in this idea of like, how can we people exchange, have this experience that is based on how the work is installed? How will that change the experience with the textile?
Actually, yes, and being able to see the front and the back, because you can walk around it. And actually, one of the slides that Ali showed of an embroidery, of that beautiful 15th century embroidery, we always show the front and the back, because the minute you have that back, it snaps into 3 dimensions, and it changes. The piece comes, you return to it some of the life that created it, and that is one of the things that we can do now with digital technology and this incredible equipment that we have now. We have always worked from the object out, and there's nothing like looking through a microscope and seeing you're right inside of something. But now we can share that. So that is a way that we can begin to return some life back to action, back to, because textiles are 3-dimensional and they're usually not standing still.
Mm-hmm. I think that the transformation of the Seminole jacket in regards to how it was mounted really kind of is an example of that successfully being accomplished.
Thank you. I think Ali can speak a little bit to that. That was a bit of a challenge for us.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think it was really seeing how those similar shirts looked on, Seminole men in the early 20th century when that was made, that helped us to kind of figure out that it fit kind of at a sloped shoulder, and all of these subtle details that that we really took into consideration, because the goal is to bring something like that to life. And I think that is something we're constantly balancing as conservators, is how do we, how do we balance all the different approaches within our work, and what is the right approach for what's in front of us? And they're different, and they work together, and that's.
Yeah, and they do all bear witness, and they carry a lot of information. And actually, in the case of that shirt, as we kind of struggled with the form, little bits of the shirt would, and they would walk into, and it became a communal project. Actually, I will say intergenerational, communal, with a deadline. So. It got pretty intense, and it was trying to get this thing to look within itself, to reclaim itself. And it was actually at some point we just configured between all of us in different ways, and the shirt just kind of all of a sudden it was in the right configuration. And that is something that we experience on many, in many different ways, but with textiles, because they do, as you say, they are witnesses to everything.
Yeah, and it's interesting in some ways, spending that dedicated time with it, we knew the piece so much better because we'd spent all this time really trying to understand it. And then I think that also contributed to why we all of a sudden, were able to. And
that was not an easy piece to make look. That's incredible work, the Seminole work. It's amazing. And from every point of view, from the design, from the craftsmanship, the concept, the whole thing. But we just couldn't get it to look, we wanted it to look that way, and we couldn't get it to communicate. And finally, it was by finding its person, I guess. That we gave it some life, but that was really we don't, especially as conservators, what we do not want is to show anything not so much as a disadvantage, but as less than what it is.
Right.
So I think we have. Okay. Now, here's one very practical one. Do you ever alter or clean or repair the reclaimed blankets or materials that you use? And actually, do you use other than blankets?
Well, I do use materials other than blankets. I use cedar and I work in glass beads and I don't know.
I meant in textiles, other thrift store items.
Oh, yeah.
Overcoats.
Other textiles, so far it's primarily been blankets, but you never know what might come into the practice. It's funny. When I first started, when I knew I wanted to use blankets as a material, and I almost think of them each as this like unique, rare tube of paint. But when I knew I wanted to use them, I would go to a thrift store and I set this specific criteria up for myself, which was that I wasn't going to spend more than $5 on a blanket. And that was an average, but really it was something that was attainable. Like I could kind of spend an average of $5 or less. And that I would, I focused on wool blankets at first. And I think for me, like wool blankets are, they're made of wool roving and I like see how they're related to sheep. And I'm thinking about that kind of animal relationship, which is compelling to me. But I also was gathering these blankets and I wasn't making any aesthetic decisions or judgments about them. If it was a wool blanket, I would purchase it. And it ended up teaching me a lot about blankets. I actually really enjoyed the image of the wool of the West tag, because I think what you start to realize with blankets is that they are objects that migrate and they immigrate and they travel places. And I think one of the things that drew me to this material is that they're oftentimes passed down because they are so useful. And you can see that sometimes on a laundry tag or a camp tag where it has a person's name on it. And I realized really quickly that those like the nibbled bits or holes and mended areas, they all tell a story about the object that was really compelling to me. And it is funny how there's the tendency to want to mend or fix those areas. I think when I'm working in collaboration with institutions, I know that I have this piece called Edson's Flag that's in the collection of the Renwick Museum, but I think that there was a photographer who wanted to edit this or kind of clean up the photo because there was this kind of mark on it, but it was actually part of this, like a stain that was on the blanket. And it was really intentional that it was there. And so I think that sometimes I run into these conversations where I'm sharing what it is that draws me to these objects. I also want to share that after things have been stitched in sewing circles, that I really honor that contribution of a stitch or an embroidered mark. And so I never will take out that mark. Like if it's a mark that isn't structurally ideal, I will reinforce an area, but I really want to honor every single hand that has contributed to the making of the object.
Yeah, because there's always thinking behind that line, behind that stitch, as there is with drawing. That really resonated when you said you think of it as an extension of drawing. It is a way of thinking, and it's thinking made tactile. I think maybe Allie, if you have a question.
Oh, I just was going to say that also, when we met with you and we said, well, we would like to stitch close these open seams, and we'll do it matching the exact area, that the same color and type of stitching that's around it. And you said, oh, you don't need to do it quite like that. You can just see yourself as a continuation of that communal sewing circle in securing the pieces closed. And I thought that was a really nice thing to take to the work when we then did prepare it for the galleries.
It's funny. I totally respect your work and what your role is in seeing that objects are available for future generations to enjoy them. From my perspective, in relationship to textile conservation, I've had experiences where I was once trying to install a piece at an institution, and it was only going to be there very shortly. It was a placeholder for a sewing circle piece that was being accomplished in the community. And so ultimately, I wasn't allowed to show this temporary placeholder because there needed to be this large conservation report effort on it. And in my mind, I thought, you don't need to do a there doesn't need to be a conservation report, a textile conservation report on this, because what is irregular or imperfect about the cloth is actually what I appreciate and love and want to showcase or highlight. So it's a little bit, I have this funny, I have deep admiration and this funny tension for what you do.
Yeah, I think that's something that's kind of come up in our dialogues, and that if you ask us how, as conservators, if you ask us how to install a textile in the gallery, we'll give you certain guidelines that are our guidelines. Under 5 foot candles, relative humidity of 50%. We'll have these guidelines that are what it should be. But that doesn't mean that in the overall taking in all aspects of what the situation is for that artwork, for that, for that piece, that's the right thing to do. I think that there's always a compromise, and it's really looking at that with every situation. And that's something that we're really discussing with this, with Native American material more and more. And that's what Cristina and I were having discussions with all of our colleagues in conservation in the museum, and with Patricia and with you. And yeah, I think it's.
And I would say, excuse me, I would add that speaking of community, we are a community, and we're very diverse, but culturally, age-wise, backgrounds, training, and so what one person sees as a piece that might be toned down, another person sees as something differently. So there are. It's very helpful to be able to have a group, a little bit of a group around you with different perspectives, because that is also that's a bit of always a bit of a question amongst ourselves. Also, how much of a treatment do you do? Do you do treatment at all? And so we wrestle. We don't wrestle with that, but it's an interesting question, and people see things differently. That I think, we still have so many questions here that we didn't get to, but I also see that we have all these questions from outside. So I'm going to turn it over to Christine to ask the questions from the outside. And I hope we can do this again, not necessarily in such a public venue, but it's been wonderful, Marie. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it too. It's been great. I think we share this appreciation for textiles. So it's been a really enjoyable conversation.
Thank you so much, Marie, Cristina, and Alexandra, for a chance to listen to this interesting conversation, discussing the roles and perspectives of the artists and conservators. As Cristina mentioned, there are a number of questions that came in. So let's start with Marie. There's a question asking, do you have a clear design concept prior to the organic evolution of Dreamcatcher, and how close to it was the final object?
That's such a great question. And it's interesting because I feel like in pieces that I was making from that time period, I definitely started by doing these drawings. And so drawings that were my pattern. And so I was staying pretty closely aligned to that. But I will share that in the case of Untitled Dreamcatcher, it really, it got started and sort of, there was a lot of work on it. And then I just hit a point with it where I wasn't sure what it wanted to be or how it should be completed. And so it actually was dormant lying fallow for, I would say, like 3 years. And then at some point I was ready to kind of like readdress it. And it really came like how the piece was resolved came through the process of working on it. And I realized what the edges would be and that the bindings would be included. And so I think in a lot of my work, as much as I like the idea of having a drawing and being able to kind of stick to it, because somehow that seems like it would be in my head. It seems like it would be more expedient, but truthfully, the process is much more organic.
So kind of a follow-up to that is like, I think I've watched another video of yours, of another presentation that Cristina shared with me. And you say that you feed your sewing community. And I'm wondering, how long do you allow for that process with the community for the sewing circle, I should say?
Yeah, I mean, the food is typically sort of on the side, and people can just kind of graze and eat when they want. I will share that when it was at my house, it was much easier. When my studio was in my house, it was much easier to kind of like have a seamless sort of relationship between the kitchen and the sewing circle. And then as the sewing circles also started to take place in other spaces, and also spaces where food is not permitted, I started making prints, GoCo prints, and more recently, some, I guess, I don't know, screen prints, stamped prints. There's a variety of different types of prints I've been making, but I exchange a print when people participate in a sewing circle. So everybody walks away with a small limited edition print. But I will say, back to the food component, I think that there is something about sitting around a table and eating food that is very similar to sitting around a table and stitching, because your eyes are diverted and your work, like with food, of course, your soul is being fed. But with stitching, cloth is so familiar to all of us, right? We wear it. We oftentimes sleep under cloth or textiles. So I think that when our eyes are when we're not forced to look at each other and our eyes are directed at cloth, and we have this tactile object in our hand and we're stitching, stories really flow. And I think that that's one of the things that I'm so drawn to. I would also like to mention that the sewing circles are really the antithesis to what a sewing bee is to me. And for me, sewing bees were used to by missionaries to colonize Indigenous women and girls. So I think that distinction is also really important to be aware of.
Thank you. That's so interesting. There's another question for you. It says, thank you for all your fascinating accounts. Maria, I love your work. As Sylvia mentioned, your work is being collected by many museums across the United States. May I ask, have you had similar conversations with those museums, curators, and conservators as you have at the Met? Or is this a new means of approach, this additional facet of your work's continuing life beyond the studio?
I think for me, one of the things that in some ways prepared me for this conversation with the conservators and curators at the Met has been my involvement with an organization called VOCA, Voices of Contemporary Art. And I won't be able to list the exact year, but a while back I was invited to do a VOCA talk where I was in conversation with the art historian and curator, James McElhenney. And in that one of the goals with VOCA is we're really, I say we because now I'm actually a part of the VOCA board, but one of the goals of VOCA is to generate a critical dialogue and interdisciplinary programming that addresses the production, presentation, and preservation of contemporary art. And so through that conversation at the Denver Art Museum and through my involvement with VOCA, I've become aware of the need for this type of conversation. And one of the things that VOCA does, there's many program arms, but one of the things that we do is we host workshops where people are given kind of a toolkit for oral history interviews around objects and how they should be or could be conserved over time with an understanding of the contemporary artist's intent. So I feel like in many ways what this conversation right now today is really amplifying what is so important to VOCA's mission.
Ali or Cristina, do you have any more questions, or should I continue with the audience questions?
I think we can give the audience more chance to ask questions right now.
This one, I guess it could be answered by Marie or the conservators. It asks, is the Untitled Dreamcatcher lined or backed? If not, is there concern about deformation during its exhibition? And if its structure is affected by gravity, is that planned to become part of its ledger? I think Marie and the conservators can both answer that.
I think that'd be an interesting one to hear both our opinions on. So for instance, for us, we will limit the time that it's on display. So, it's but it is also fully backed. But maybe Marie, you wanted to tell more about that.
So is it fully backed? Like, did you back it beyond?
Oh, no, we didn't back it.
No.
But you, but it's not just there's two layers.
Yes.
There's some of it, the stitching goes through both layers and some, it only goes through the one.
Yeah. That is like such a good question for me, because one of the first pieces I ever had acquired into a museum, it was the Portland Art Museum. And at some point I was invited to see it installed and we looked at it together. And I was told that they did back the piece. And I actually felt like it changed the nature of it. And they did it without like asking me. It was just the natural protocol of the museum to do that. And I would say this was, quite a while ago. But, and so I would say that having this type of conversation and understanding the artist's intent, and also for the artist to understand what why from a conservation practice point of view, piece would be backed is really important. But in my particular, in this case, in the case of Untitled Dreamcatcher, it would be my hope that it wouldn't be backed. I mean, I actually think that that again is like part of the life of the object. Like these blankets, there's so much character, and in a way, like they're continuing to live in the world and be imprinted upon, right? And so like just that gravity like is part of that part of the nature is really compelling to me.
And I would say that we do not automatically back something like your Dreamcatcher for all of those flappy pieces. It's a pretty sturdy piece. It supports its own weight. And so it isn't going to be distorted. If we would add that, it would be to not to alter it, but to keep it, to stop the action. But so it's not something we automatically do.
I have a question for you. I'm really curious about how do textile conservation practices in the Met change in the American or Indigenous art collection in contrast to the museum's modern art galleries? And I say that as a person who's kind of exhibited across those platforms. But one thing I have concerns with as a contemporary Indigenous artist is just how certain exhibition spaces present the artwork in low light and low ceilings and kind of darkness, which changes the reception and perception of the work in contrast to it being in a space that's larger, taller ceilings and more light.
That is a much more complicated question. There are many more players and many more reasons for that. I would say that in terms of our approach, we approach everything the same way, which is, what do we have here? And the difference with these Indigenous, well, with now is that when we can, well, we do actually take into consideration the community. Ali, do you want to say something about that?
Oh no, I think what you're saying is kind of where we're at right now, where we have certain guidelines. We're also often limited by the space, and there's certain kind of preventative measures that we have to take on every textile, right? So, or we aim to take in terms of having, if it's your piece is wool, so we wanted to encase it in a case to protect it for many reasons. But it really depends on so many factors within our space. But I think that there is an opportunity for more discussion about that. And I think that's something that, is a combination of the curator, the conservators, and consulting with community members and artists, and just having more dialogue that's going to continue to progress our understanding of how best to care and present work in a collection like this, and textiles in particular.
Is there a program within the department that where what we are doing and the conversations we've had, is that becoming more normalized, or not normalized, but is that like a new part of?
I think we've made a good start, Marie. I think this is
I see,
because it's so great for us. It's so much fun to talk about from the different entry points. So yes, we see if there's a good future for it.
Sorry to interrupt. I hate that we are running to the end of our time here. And so thank you all for your wonderful questions from our audience and for joining us today. And I especially wanted to thank all of our speakers, Marie, Ali, Cristina, Christine, Yanina, and Sylvia for this wonderful presentation. We're so grateful that you could share this dialogue with us. And thank you all for joining us.